Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the October 2025 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook of Chapter 32, Historical Tendency of Capitalist Accumulation, from Karl Marx's Capital, Volume 1 from 1867. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So, Chapter 32 is the second to last chapter in Capital Volume 1, and it's part of Part 8 of 8, Primitive Accumulation, which deals with how capitalism arose out of feudalism. The previous chapter talked about colonialism and the acquisition of wealth, basically just by theft and slavery, and the previous chapters talked about some of the internal transformations of countries like England, which Marx considers the classical example of a country turning from feudalism to capitalism. And in this very brief chapter, Marx is going to wrap it all up, talking about some of the final hurdles that the capitalists face in setting up their system to run basically for as long as they can get it to run. So we get a short summary here of how the capitalists transform private property into specifically capitalist private property or bourgeois property with the socialization of the labor process. Let's begin. What does the primitive accumulation of capital, i.e. its historical genesis, resolve itself into? Insofar as it's not immediate transformation of slaves and serfs into wage laborers, and therefore a mere change of form, it only means the expropriation of the immediate producers, i.e. the dissolution of private property based on the labor of its owner. Private property, as the antithesis to social collective property, exists only where the means of labor and the external conditions of labor belong to private individuals. But according as these private individuals are laborers or not laborers, private property has a different character. The numberless shades that it at first sight presents correspond to the intermediate stages lying between these two extremes. The private property of the laborer in their means of production is the foundation of petty industry, whether agricultural, manufacturing, or both. Petty industry, again, is an essential condition for the development of social production and of the free individuality of the laborer themselves. Of course, this petty mode of production exists also under slavery, serfdom, and other states of dependence, but it flourishes. It lets loose its whole energy. It attains its adequate classical form only where the laborer is the private owner of their own means of labor set in action by themselves, the peasant of the land which they cultivate, the artisan of the tool which they handle as a virtuoso. This mode of production presupposes parceling of the soil and scattering of the other means of production. As it excludes the concentration of these means of production, so also it excludes cooperation, division of labor within each separate process of production, the control over and the productive application of the forces of nature by society, and the free development of the social productive powers. It is compatible only with a system of production and a society moving within narrow and more or less primitive bounds. To perpetuate it would be, as Pecker rightly says, quote, to decree universal mediocrity, unquote. At a certain stage of development, it brings forth the material agencies for its own dissolution. From that moment, new forces and new passions spring up in the bosom of society. But the old social organization fetters them and keeps them down. It must be annihilated. It is annihilated. Its annihilation, the transformation of the individualized and scattered means of production into socially concentrated ones, of the pygmy property of the many into the huge property of the few, the expropriation of the great mass of the people from the soil, from the means of subsistence, and from the means of labor. This fearful and painful expropriation of the mass of the people forms the prelude to the history of capital. It comprises a series of forcible methods of which we have passed in review only those that have been epoch-making as measures of the primitive accumulation of capital. The expropriation of the immediate producers was accomplished with merciless vandalism, and under the stimulus of passions the most infamous, the most sordid, the pettiest, the most meanly odious. Self-earned private property, that is based, so to say, on the fusing together of the isolated, independent laboring individual with the conditions of their labor, is supplanted by capitalistic private property, which rests on exploitation of the nominally free labor of others, i.e. on wage labor. Footnote quoting Sismondi, we are in a situation which is entirely new for society. We are striving to separate every kind of property from every kind of labor, unquote. Back to the main text. As soon as this process of transformation has sufficiently decomposed the old society from top to bottom, as soon as the laborers are turned into proletarians, their means of labor into capital, As soon as the capitalist mode of production stands on its own feet, then the further socialization of labor and further transformation of the land and other means of production into socially exploited, and therefore common means of production, as well as the further expropriation of private proprietors, takes a new form. That which is now to be expropriated is no longer the laborer working for themselves, but the capitalist exploiting many laborers. This expropriation is accomplished by the action of the immanent laws of capitalistic production itself, by the centralization of capital. One capitalist always kills many. Hand in hand with the centralization, or this expropriation of many capitalists by few, develop, on an ever-extending scale, the cooperative form of the labor process, the conscious technical application of science, the methodical cultivation of the soil, the transformation of the instruments of labor into instruments of labor only usable in common, the economizing of all means of production by their use as means of production of combined, socialized labor, the entanglement of all peoples in the net of the world market, and with this, the international character of the capitalistic regime, along with the constantly diminishing number of the magnates of capital, who usurp and monopolize all advantages of this process of transformation, grows the mass of misery, oppression, slavery, degradation, exploitation. But with this too grows the revolt of the working class, a class always increasing in numbers and disciplined, united, organized by the very mechanism of the process of capitalist production itself. The monopoly of capital becomes a fetter upon the mode of production, which has sprung up and flourished along with and under it. Centralization of the means of production and socialization of labor at last reach a point where they become incompatible with their capitalist integument. This integument is burst asunder. The knell of capitalist private property sounds. The expropriators are expropriated. The capitalist mode of appropriation, the result of the capitalist mode of production, produces capitalist private property. This is the first negation of individual private property, as founded on the labor of the proprietor. But capitalist production begets, with the inexorability of a law of nature, its own negation. It is the negation of negation. This does not re-establish private property for the producer, but gives them individual property based on the acquisition of the capitalist era, i.e. on cooperation and the possession in common of the land and of the means of production. The transformation of scattered private property arising from individual labor into capitalist private property is naturally a process incomparably more protracted, violent, and difficult than the transformation of capitalistic private property, already practically resting on socialized production, into socialized property. In the former case, we had the expropriation of the mass of the people by a few usurpers. In the latter, we have the expropriation of a few usurpers by the mass of the people. And a footnote, the advance of industry, whose involuntary promoter is the bourgeoisie, replaces the isolation of the laborers due to competition by their revolutionary combination due to association. The development of modern industry therefore cuts from under its feet the very foundation on which the bourgeoisie produces and appropriates products. What the bourgeoisie therefore produces above all are its own grave diggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. Of all the classes that stand face to face with the bourgeoisie today, the proletariat alone is a really revolutionary class. The other classes perish and disappear in the face of modern industry. The proletariat is its special and essential product. The lower middle classes, the small manufacturers, the shopkeepers, the artisan, the peasant, all these fight against the bourgeoisie to save from extinction their existence as fractions of the middle class. They are reactionary, for they try to roll back the wheel of history. And this, of course, is a quote from Marx and Engels' Manifesto of the Communist Party. And that's the end of Chapter 32. What do you think? Leave a question or comment below, and we will continue the discussion in the comments section as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons and Buy Me a Coffee supporters whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. Every donation's encouraging, and they allow me to spend a lot more time on this channel than I'd be able to do without that support. So if you like this channel and want to see more from it, thank me, but also thank a patron or Buy Me a Coffee supporter, and consider becoming one yourself. Beyond that, engagement counts, so like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment, even if it's just for the algorithm. And remember, we can agitate and educate online, but the organizing happens in real life. So make sure to take what you've learned here and apply it in your real-world political organizing. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video.